Hello, early American literature friends. This video is a guide to the spring chapter of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Walden is considered one of the masterpieces of American literature. When American literature was invented as a class that could be taken, as a thing that could be studied in the early 20th century, Walden was recognized as one of the sort of 8 foundational pieces of American literature, as one of the sort of key, like I said, cornerstones of American literature. Henry David Thoreau lived from 1817 until 1862. He died from tuberculosis in 1862. Walden, which the spring chapter is the next to last chapter of Walden. It is considered the climax of Walden, the penultimate chapter. Walden, he lived at Walden Pond, which is a pond in Massachusetts. It's about 20 or 30 minutes away from Boston. It is like slightly northwest of Boston. He lived at Walden from 1845. He moved there. He lived on a plot of land that was owned by his friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He moved there on July 4th, 1845, lived there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And so when he talks about spring in this chapter, he is talking about the spring of 1846 and 1847. Thoreau is one of our 2 or 3 most important transcendentalists. Transcendentalism is a philosophical movement that began in America in the early and mid 18th century. So right as Thoreau was coming to adulthood in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. Transcendentalism is defined by this reliance on intuition and the conscience, that the conscience mind can sense and determine what the right thing to do is. A transcending of physical and empirical limitations through that reliance. This sort of reliance on yourself and on your ability to do things on your own. Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Bronson Alcott are the largest American transcendentalists. Transcendentalism believed in living close to nature. That is how, when you were close to nature, you were in touch with the core sort of energy of humankind, like human nature and the natural world were connected. And that's why you could rely on yourself, because you were in touch with nature and your natural instincts. Taught the dignity of manual labor, for Thoreau, that meant like farming and growing your own food and things like that. Working with your hands, making things with your own hands. They strongly felt the need of intellectual companionship. They emphasized spiritual living. Every person's relationship to God was to be established directly by the individual. So transcendentalists were not interested in Catholicism or the priesthood or anything like that. They believed that everybody developed and maintained their own relationship with God or the divine, rather than through ritualistic churches and rituals at churches. They held that human beings were divine in their own right, because if you understand the natural world as created by some God or all-powerful being, well then if human beings are a part of that natural world and integrated into that natural world and close to nature, well then they are a part of that divinity. And an opinion in opposition to puritanical New England, and again you think back to Hawthorne and this sort of idea of original sin and that man's innate nature is sinful in darkness. The Transcendentalists were opposed to that and believed that people were born divine, and it was when you distance yourself from nature, that's where the corruption came in. As a result, self-trust and self-reliance were to be practiced at all times, because to trust itself was really to trust the voice of God speaking intuitively through us, through nature and through ourselves connected to nature. That is Transcendentalism. It was a big philosophical movement, like I said, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, even into the 1860s. It really dominated in New England. Many of these writers lived in and around Boston and Massachusetts. The Transcendentalists, part of the New England Renaissance of this same time, the 30 or 40 years before the Civil War. The Transcendentalists were a sort of subset of that New England Renaissance, and Thoreau belonged to that. He was born, his father invented the number 2 pencil, and his father owned a pencil factory. Thoreau, though, Walden was his second book. He had written a book. He wrote a book while he was living at Walden Pond during the 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days about a rafting trip that he and his brother had taken. And then after and then he started writing Walden while he was living at the pond and finished it later. Walden tells this story of sort of self-reliance. One of the myths attached to Thoreau is that he was like living out in the woods by himself, like some sort of frontier wildman. That is not true. He could walk into town anytime he wanted to. It was only if you walk down the railroad tracks there, which he talks about in the end of the spring chapter, it was like 2 or 3 miles at most to town. He was not like out in the woods, living in the wilderness, secluded. People came to see him. He went into town at least 2 or 3 times a week to eat dinner with his friends and hang out with his friends. He was not living this deeply isolated life. He just built a cabin, a small cabin, a like 10 by 12 cabin on his friend's property and lived there. So he could be kind of secluded. He was out of town and he was secluded in that sense and being alone with his thoughts and like interacting with nature. But he was not like 50 miles out into the wilderness. He was just a few miles out of town. If he needed to walk into town, he could do it any time. He often did. He just believed in this sort of quiet solitude interaction with nature. Spring, the chapter that we're going to talk about is called Spring because it's about spring. And one of the important things, there's 2 really important things happening in spring. The first is the structure of it. And if you think about how he begins and ends this chapter, you will understand that structure. And other parts of it filter in as he goes because he sort of teaches you the progress of spring. But the first thing the spring chapter starts with is the ice melting on Walden Pond. And so spring begins when the ice melts off the pond. And then the last thing that he talks about at the very end of the chapter is the pollen and the trees, all the tree pollen coming down into and laying on the pond. And so for him, spring begins when the ice first starts to melt off the pond, and then spring has ended and summer has taken over when the pollen comes down and things begin to pollinate and grow and be reborn. And so what I'm going to try to do, the second key idea that he talks about in this, and which is a much more philosophical transcendentalist idea, see if we can find a picture of Thoreau's cabin here. Walden Pond. His cabin is not there anymore. It was torn down. There is a replica of it that is in the parking lot of Walden Pond. You see there's a picture of Walden Pond. Walden Pond is a state park now. You can go visit it. There is a replica of his cabin that is in the parking lot for Walden Pond, and there's the inside of the replica. But the philosophical part of Walden as a whole, and you get a lot of it in the spring chapter, is his sense that there is nothing inorganic, and he even straight up says this at one point in the spring chapter, but that everything is connected, and there are natural laws that govern, the same natural law that governs the veins in leaves governs the veins in human beings. And the same natural law that like pushes water down creeks and into rivers pushes blood like through your blood veins and arteries and things like that. Like it's the same impulse, the same energy. And so all of the animating forces of nature are the same and they follow the same rules. And that is a central idea that he sneaks into spring. But he gets you into spring in this really simple way where he talks about the opening of large tracts by the ice cutters. Now I'm going to jump over to the text itself here too. This is something that we don't understand if you guys lived in the South, and especially in the 20th and 21st century. People used to not have ice, and so ice, the way you would get ice is huge blocks of it would be cut out of frozen lakes and rivers in the north and shipped all over the world. There was a huge market for ice in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It would be kept in like cedar shavings or hay or things like that and shipped around the world. Really into the 1930s in this country, the 1930s and even the early 1940s during World War II. And so what he's talking about is sometimes the ice isn't allowed to melt by itself because the ice cutters come and cut big blocks of ice out. And he spends a good bit of time in the first couple of paragraphs, really first 2 or 3 paragraphs, talking about if the ice is left alone. He talks about how Walden is the deepest pond in the area, and so it's the last one to start melting. He talks about it indicates better than any water hereabouts the absolute progress of the season. And what he means by absolute progress is the season is spring has really come. Like there's not going to be another cold snap. Winter's really over. When Walden starts thawing, you know winter's really over and spring has begun. Being least affected by transient changes in temperatures because Walden is the deepest pond in the area. So when it starts to melt, it really starts to melt. The ice in the shallowest part was at this time several inches thinner than in the middle. And he talks about how at the very end of winter, as spring begins to come, he talks about the way ice melts. It melts slower where it's deeper and quicker where it's shallower because the ground is warming up quicker. Then you get this, the phenomena of the year take place every day in a pond on a small scale. Every morning the shallow water is warmed more rapidly than the deep, though it may not be so warm after all. The day is an epitome of the year. And so he says, like, one day is a sort of microcosm or miniature version of a year. The night is the winter, the morning and evening are spring and fall, and the noon is the summer. And so what he again is thinking is, like, nature always follows these same basic rules. Days work like years. There are all these connections that he wants you to see and that he is trying to make. The cracking and booming of the ice indicated change in temperature. For him, again, like, winter is in one part of the day or one part of the year is ending and a new part is beginning in this sort of cycle of life. And that's an important idea in Thoreau too, is to sort of, there is no death, there is just a ongoing cycle of life that replenishes and restarts and refreshes itself. The pond, and he talks about the pond does not thunder every evening. The pond thundering is the ice cracking and at times even drifting into the shore and making these loud thundering noises. One attraction in coming to the woods to live was that I should have leisure and opportunity to see the spring come in. So he's talking about getting to observe day by day this sort of transition of the world out of winter and into spring. The days have grown sensibly longer. I see how I shall get through the winter without adding to my wood pile. So he knows not have to cut any more wood because the winter is over. I'm on the alert for the first signs of spring, to hear the chance note of some arriving bird or the striped squirrel's chirp. He's thinking about these other signs of spring and what signals that. On the 13th of March, after I'd heard the bluebird, song sparrow, and redwing, the ice was still nearly a foot thick. So he's talking about this sort of hybrid moment. The ice is still in the pond, but he's hearing birds, and he's thinking spring's coming, but it's still early spring. We're still in this transition. And he talks about Walden completely opening up. That means you could, like, boat across it. There was no ice in it. He tells this story about a duck hunter who hears, and this is the paragraph that starts off every incident connected with the breaking up the rivers and the ponds and the settling of the weather. It's this paragraph right here, every incident. He talks about a duck hunter who hears a big chunk of ice slamming into the edge of a lake. He talks about how this happens often every spring because, like, the ice around the edges of the lakes melts and then it drifts and the frozen pieces drift and slam into the sides of the pond. Then he gets into one of the most famous images in all of Walden, which is the few phenomena gave me more delight than to observe the forms which thawing sand and clay assume in flowing down the sides of a deep cut on the railroad. This is where he transitions into thinking about human forms, natural forms, and how they take shape. If you don't know what he's talking about a railroad cut, which would look like this. There are many railroad cuts, like where a railroad is cut into a mountain, and he is looking at the sides of a bank right here, and he is watching how in the morning when the sun shines directly on the bank and it thaws out from the winter, things start flowing out into the sand and clay. He says, I'm going to jump back over to the actual text here. He says, the material is sand of every degree of fineness, various rich colors commonly mixed with a little clay. Innumerable little streams overlap and interlace one with another. As it flows, it takes the form of sappy leaves or vines. And as you look down on them, the lacinated, lobed, and imbricated thalluses of some lichens, or you are reminded of coral, of leopard's paws, bird's feet, brains, or lungs, or bowels, excrement of all kinds. It is a truly grotesque vegetation. That's an important moment because what he is doing is he is looking at this sort of flow, water flowing with sand and clay down the edge of the bank, and he says, this is how all nature flows. This is how it all works. And you can see it taking the shape of leaves or vines or leopard's paws or bird's feet or brain or lungs. And he is saying when things in nature spread, they always spread in this same pattern. So he is identifying this connection, this sameness of natural law. When the flowing mass reaches the drain at the foot of the bank, it spreads onto flatter strands, gradually becoming more flat and broad, and in which you can trace the original forms of vegetation, till at length in the water itself they are converted into banks, like those formed off the mouths of rivers. And so he's thinking about, again, like you're seeing a miniature version of how rivers flow into the ocean. You're seeing sort of miniature versions of nature and natural laws. The whole bank, which is from 20 to 40 feet high, I'm going to scroll this down too because we're jumping into the next paragraph. The whole bank, which is from 20 to 40 feet high, sometimes overlaid with the mass of this kind of foliage. The produce of one spring day. I'm affected as if in a peculiar sense I stood in the laboratory of the artist who made the world and me. So he watches this flow on this railroad cut on the side of this bank, and he feels like he is watching how God makes all things, the artist who made the world and me. That would be God or some divine being or something like that. I feel as if I were nearer to the vitals of the globe. No wonder that the earth expresses itself outwardly in leaves. It is a moist, thick lobe. The feathers and wings of birds are still drier and thinner leaves. Thus also you pass from the lumpish grub in the earth to the airy and fluttering butterfly. The whole tree itself is but one leaf, and rivers are still vaster leaves, whose pulp is intervening earth, and towns and cities are the ova of insects in their axils. And so you see him making all these connections between vegetation and animal life and human life and the natural world, and he is saying it all follows these same basic principles of flow and spread and veins and things like that. When the sun withdraws, the sand ceases to flow. This is the next paragraph. But in the morning, the streams will start once more. You see perchance how blood vessels are formed. If you look closely, you observe that first there pushes forward from the thawing mass a stream of softened sand with a drop-like point, like the ball of a finger, feeling its way slowly and blindly downward. A meandering channel or artery. What is man but a mass of thawing clay? The ball of the human finger is but a drop, congealed. The fingers and toes flow to their extent from the thawing mass of the body. And so he says when you look at the spread of things on the bank, you're also looking at how the human body is made and how fingers grow out of hands and toes grow out of feet and how the body grows and develops. He says, what is man but a mass of thawing clay? And again, he is making these connections between the natural world and humans and humanity and saying that everything abides by these natural laws. Is not the hand a spreading palm leaf? The ear may be regarded as a lichen. The lip laps or lapses from the sides of the cavernous mouth, and the nose is a manifest congealed drop or stalactite. Each rounded lobe of the vegetable leaf, too, is a thick and now loitering drop, larger or smaller. The lobes are the fingers of the leaf. And you see him making this argument that connects all things in nature and this sort of scientific method of making these connections and saying everything follows the same natural law. Thus it seemed that this one hillside illustrated the principle of all the operations of nature. Oh, there you go, all the operations of nature. The maker of this earth but patented a leaf, and everything just follows the rule of the leaf. This is the frost coming out of the ground. This is spring. It precedes the green and flowery spring, as mythology precedes regular poetry. So he's talking early spring before everything turns green, when things are thawing. And then one of the most famous lines in this chapter. The earth is not a mere fragment of dead history, stratum upon stratum like the leaves of a book to be studied by geologists and antiquaries, but it is living poetry, like the leaves of a tree, which precede flowers and fruit, not a fossil earth, but a living earth, compared with whose great central life, all vegetable and animal life, is merely parasitic. And so he is saying that the earth is this living thing that is constantly renewing and refreshing itself, and that it is not like these layers of dead things like the pages of a book or dead trees. It is this living organism that is constantly regenerating and renewing itself. And human beings and animals are almost parasitically living on top of the earth that is constantly renewing and refreshing itself. He jumps forward when the ground was partially bare of snow, so he's jumping forward, the snow is melting. The first tender signs of the infant year, life everlasting, goldenrods, pinweeds, graceful wild grasses. You see him, the next step in spring coming is the first flowers arriving. It brings back the summer to our winter memories. At the approach of spring, the red squirrels got under my house, 2 at a time, directly under my feet. So next step in spring, these squirrels are coming out, and he can hear them under the floorboards of his house. And then he keeps rolling you forward. More spring, the first sparrow of spring, which is right here, the next paragraph. The first sparrow of spring, the year beginning with younger hope than ever. The sinking sound of melting snow is heard in all dells, and ice dissolves apace in the ponds. The grass flames up on the hillsides like a spring fire, as if the earth sent forth an inward heat. And not yellow, but green is the color of its flame, the symbol of perpetual youth, the grass blade. Grass is really important to Thoreau. It's an important imagery. It's an important image in his sense of like the cycle of life and regeneration and renewal, because it dies down in the winter and then comes back. So it's never really dead. It's just hibernating and then cycling back to life. And then he brings you back to the pond itself. Walden is melting apace. There are 2 canal rods wide along the northerly and westerly sides, and so pieces of the big sections of the pond are clear. It's melting, and he gives you the next thing you see in the change from storm and winter to serene and weather, to serene and mild weather, from dark and sluggish hours to bright and elastic ones. He talks about seeing some geese, which is the next step, because geese are migratory birds, so they're coming back north. Again, another signal that like the seasons are progressing and full spring is coming. In the morning, I watch the geese from the door through the mist, sailing in the middle of the pond. And he watches them. Next step, for a week, I heard the circling, groping clangor of some solitary goose in the foggy morning, seeking its companion. So the geese continue to migrate like they're headed to Canada, but he sees there's this one leftover goose that is still looking for its companion. And in that same paragraph, in that same for a week paragraph, he talks about hearing pigeons and martins, again, more migratory birds, signs that the season is changing as a whole. The birds are flying back north. As every season seems best to us in its turn, so the coming in of spring is like the creation of cosmos out of chaos. For Thoreau, spring comes and it is like bringing order to the world. It is like the Big Bang, like when God gave order to the world in the Christian iconography and mythology. And then you get his sort of sense of how people should exist in nature and in relationship to nature. A single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener. So our prospects brighten on the influx of better thoughts. We should be blessed if we lived in the present always and took advantage of every accident that befell us, like the grass which confesses the influence of the slightest dew that falls on it, and did not spend our time in atoning for the neglect of past opportunities. We loiter in winter while it is already spring. In a pleasant spring morning, all men's sins are forgiven. Such a day is a truce to vice. And so he says the way that people should be is the way the grass is, that constantly living in the moment, not worrying about the past, but responding to the stimuluses and activities and responding to the moment in the moment and living in the moment, living like grass, as he says right here. This is one of his central philosophical ideas, is you can't be living in the past. You can't be worrying about winter when you're in spring. You've got to be living in that moment. A return to goodness in the next paragraph. A return to goodness produced each day in the tranquil and beneficent breath of the morning causes down in respect to the love of virtue and the hatred of vice. And so it's like every morning is this renewal, this refreshing, and people need to be open to that influence and receptive to that influence and live that way. On the 29th of April, as I was fishing from the bank of the river near the 9-acre corner bridge, standing on the quaking grass and willow roots, I observed a very slight and graceful hawk, like a night hawk. So he sees the hawk, and this is another sign of the progress or the process of spring coming to him, because he's got the hunt of the predatory birds coming, the next step in the sort of migratory birds. Besides this, I got a rare mesh of golden and silver and bright cupreous fishes, which look like a string of jewels. There needs no stronger proof of immortality. All things must live in such a light. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where was thy victory then? And again, he reads spring as in this sort of Christian iconography of there is no death. There is this constant renewal and rebirth, and life just processes on and goes on. Life is not this chronology. It is a cycle that cycles and cycles and cycles through. And then you get his more famous thoughts about nature and wilderness and how useful, like being in nature and being close to nature and in wild landscapes are useful to human beings. Our village life would stagnate, and he means like city life, living in town, not being close to nature. It would stagnate if it were not for the unexplored forests and meadows which surround it. We need the tonic of wildness, and by wildness he doesn't mean people being wild. He means wild, untouched, untamed landscapes. To wade sometimes in marshes where the bittern and the meadow hen lurk. At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be infinitely wild, unsurveyed, and unfathomed by us because unfathomable. We can never have enough of nature. That's a central idea in Thoreau, and you can connect it back to transcendentalism, because to be close to you have to be close to nature to sort of be close to man's natural state of being, and it is this sort of spiritual connection between natural laws and human nature. And so if you are removed from nature, you are disconnected from those sort of overarching rules and laws and energies. We need to witness our own limits transgressed, and some life pasturing freely where we never wander. We are cheered when we observe the vulture feeding on the carrion, which disgusts and disheartens us, and deriving health and strength from the repast. There was a dead horse in the hollow by the path to my house. And he tells this story about this dead horse that he had to walk by, and it smelled awful. But even the dead horse gave him faith and belief in the cycle of life, because what it showed him and proved to him was, even this awful, stinky dead horse, like the vultures were eating it. And so even that was a part of the cycle of life that kept life going and thriving and nourishing. I love to see that nature is so rife with life that myriads can be afforded to be sacrificed and suffered to prey on one another. So the birds preying on the dead horse. And then you get to the end of the chapter. Early in May, the oaks, hickories, maples, and other trees imparted a brightness like sunshine to the landscape. Well, there's the pollen. On the 3rd or 4th of May, I saw a loon in the pond, and I heard the whippoorwill, the brown thrasher, the veery, the wood pewee, the chewink, and other birds. So all the birds are there now. It's full on spring. You've gotten to the end of spring. The sulfur-like pollen of the pitch pine soon covered the pond, and stones and rotten wood along the shore, so that you could collect it a barrelful. This is the sulfur showers we hear of. And so the seasons went rolling on into summer as one rambles into higher and higher grass. I finally left Walden September 6, 1847, 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days after he had gone to live there on 4th of July, 1845. That gives you within that you can see him sort of balancing these sort of basic details of his existence at Walden, like looking at the birds and catching fish and talking to this guy who's hunting ducks, with his more philosophical ideas about the connections between the laws of nature, the laws of mankind, the laws of vegetation, all these connections that he is making. And he is saying everything is connected, which is why he says everybody needs wildness and needs to be connected to nature, because that connection reminds you that everything is connected and everything works abiding by these same laws and same energies, and that human beings and animals are like these sort of parasitic beings existing on the sort of constantly renewed life of the earth and the vegetative world. I hope that helps you understand Thoreau and Walden. Let's see. You see, like I said, you see Thoreau there. There are only 2 existing photos of Thoreau. This is the one that you commonly see of him in 1856, and then there is a later one of him. Let's see if we can find it on here. There is an earlier engraving of him before photography had come to the United States, and then there he is later in his life, just a couple of years before his death. He died on May 6, 1862. This picture is from 1861. You see him. That is the other famous photograph that you often see of him later in his life. The 2 books that he is famous for are Walden, this book, and Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which is the book about him rafting down these rivers with his brother. He also has several famous essays. The most famous of them is Civil Disobedience, but he also has a plea for Captain John Brown. If you know who John Brown was, he was an anti-slavery activist who Thoreau thought should not be executed. But hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about Thoreau, and through Thoreau, a little bit about transcendentalism, or vice versa. I hope this is helpful to you. Hope you're doing well.